Hello. Thank you for joining us for this session, Top 2021 IECC Efficiency Proposals for Northwest Voters. I'm Connie Empress, Communications Manager here at New Buildings Institute. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping things to tell you about. First, you are muted and we cannot hear you. This helps keep the background noise down so that everyone can better hear the speakers. I want to direct you to the dashboard that you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you are having technical difficulties and cannot see the slides or hear our speakers, you can use the question pane in this dashboard to let us know, and we will help you as we go. Please ask questions in that question pane as they come up. We'll take a few questions at the end of the presentation. At the end of the webinar session, you will be given the opportunity to take a short survey. You will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with links to the recording and slides for this session. Our topic and speaker today will be introduced by NBI's Program Director, Amy Cortez. Amy, pass it over to you.
Thanks, Connie. Good morning and welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us to learn a little bit more about the top proposals for Northwest voters. As many of you know, we're in the middle of a process for the 2021 IECC, the International Energy Conservation Code updates. And what we want to do here today is explain a little bit about how these proposals are working for, especially for those that are most familiar for the Northwest. Connie, can you advance the slide, please? So we'd like to thank the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. This webinar is made possible through their funding and support, and they have been involved in the code update process. So thanks to NIA. So just as a quick reminder, the 2021 IECC update is a year-long process, started at the beginning of this year with proposals. We are now at the point where the governmental member voting representatives that represent government agencies from across the country are all registered as their GMVRs. So this validation process is, it was completed September 23rd was the deadline, and now we have the roster of voters. And we are just ahead of the hearings, the final action hearings that are going to take place next week, beginning in next week in Clark County, Nevada. So we are kind of coming towards the end of this process with the online voting scheduled for November. The dates are tentative still, between the 13th and 27th are the dates that we have now. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just mention that this webinar is really a technical webinar, and we are trying to focus on how some of these code proposals and concepts relate specifically to the Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana. However, for those of you who may be less technical or are new to the process, we do have another webinar coming up in November, which will be a more general summary of the IECC process, energy codes in general, and more of a high-level overview, whereas this one is going to be a little bit more technical. So if anyone's interested, you can register for that November 6th webinar at newbuildings.org/events. Next slide. So today we're very lucky to have Eric Makala here to give us some insights into these proposals. Eric is the codes director at New Buildings Institute. He has over 30 years of building energy codes expertise working across the United States as well as abroad. Eric supports NBI's broader engagement in code development with an emphasis on stretch codes and multi-family code adoption. And I'm going to pass it over to Eric now to explain some of these proposals.
Great, thanks, Amy. As Amy had mentioned, we from a New Buildings Institute standpoint, we also represent the Northwest Energy Codes Group, which is a NEA-funded activity to basically help advance energy codes on a national level, because what we're finding is if we can increase the efficiency of the IECC, that directly benefits the Northwest. Certainly Washington State bases their base codes off the IECC and modifies it. In Oregon will be using the IECC on the residential side for all of their multifamily, but they've adopted 90.1 for other commercial buildings. Idaho will adopt the IECC or can adopt the IECC, and as does Montana. So what we can do at a national level, again, investing there directly benefits efficiency gains from a Northwest standpoint. So what I want to do in the next bit is first go through the residential, kind of the major changes in the residential that you need to be aware about. If you want to take a look at close detail, if you could go to the next slide, please, Connie. There is a complete monograph on ICC's website that will explain all the public comments for the proposals, essentially it explains all the public comments in detail. And so it's worthwhile downloading this from ICC's website. We had several proposals actually passed during the code development hearings that were held in Albuquerque this spring. And those proposals, a lot of those got public comments on it for both the residential and the commercial side. There are, the count here, approximately 168 public comments on proposals for residential and 159 for the commercial side. So let's go and take a look at some of the residential proposals that, again, will things that you should be looking at from a Northwest perspective. And again, I'll present kind of this as objectively as I possibly can. I really encourage you to read about the proposals in the monograph and to be able to form your decisions on if this is a good thing or not a good thing from a Northwest standpoint. If you can go to the next slide, please. So the first proposal I want to talk about is for the opaque envelope. And so this is actually requiring more insulation in wall systems, the ceiling assembly, and also for slab on grade, actually requiring deeper slab edge insulation to be installed. These are code change proposals number 49 and 36, or 29 and 36. These did not pass in Albuquerque, and so public comments were submitted to try to get them in. Essentially, for the Northwest climate zones, we would be bumping up the insulation levels from a 49 to an R60 for ceiling insulation. And then for wood frame walls, if you went prescriptive, you would be required to install continuous insulation for wall systems. So if you went prescriptive again for climate zone 5, there would be no cavity insulation only options using this table. Now, the one thing to realize is that this is only one method of going through compliance. There are the UA trade-off approach, the U factor approach, performance approach. So this kind of sets the base case, but you can trade off levels of insulation. So this is just, again, one option. If you can go to the next slide, please. Another proposal that came up was actually to increase or put a requirement for solar heat gain coefficient for climate zone 5. So we're looking at, for example, the Boise area, where right now from the last few years, maybe not this year, the temperatures have, Boise typically has a high number of days during the summertime where it's 100 degrees and above. And so solar heat gain coefficient is advantageous there because you can actually reduce your cooling load by putting in a lower SHGC window. Right now, there is no requirement by code, so this would actually require at least a 0.40. Most of the windows that are on the market right now in those areas already have a fairly low solar heat gain coefficient because your U factor requirement is a 0.30, or actually the code U factor requirement is a 0.30, and typically the solar heat gain value tracks the U factor requirement. So a 0.30 window would typically have a solar heat gain coefficient of around 0.30, if not a little bit lower. So so a lot of the windows on the market would already comply with this code requirement, but this does give you the ability to take credit for this when you're doing your ACCA Manual J heating and cooling load calculations to be able to reduce your air conditioning size. So this is code change proposal number RE37, and again, it's another good one to take a very close look at. Connie, if you can go to the next slide, please. So there's been, the U.S. Department of Energy conducted several residential energy code compliance studies over the years. And as part of that study, they decided to test all ductwork regardless of whether it was in conditioned space or unconditioned space. The thought of not testing ducts in conditioned space was that, well, if the ducts leak, it's just going to leak into the conditioned space anyway, so it's not going to cause any issues. What they found is that a lot of ducts in conditioned spaces leak in doing the testing. I know that we were involved in studies in Kentucky, and even though all the ducts were located in conditioned space, they could barely test out because the ducts were so leaky. So a code change proposal was submitted to actually require that all ducts be tested regardless of location. And ducts in conditioned space, the leakage rate would be higher than what is currently required by code. So you could have a leakage rate up to 8 CFM per 100 square feet. What this would do is essentially make sure that the conditioned air from the mechanical system actually has a much better chance of getting to the space that you're trying to get it to be either be able to heat that space or cool that space. So this again, I think is an important one for the Northwest. I know, there's a lot of testing being done in the Northwest from a duct leakage standpoint, and this I think is an important requirement to actually make sure that ducts don't leak regardless of where they are. So again, this is going to be RE112. If we can go to the next slide, please. One of the code change proposals that came up was making sure that testing is done on ventilation systems. Right now in the IRC, you are required to put in mechanical ventilation on buildings that test, I think, less than 5 air changes an hour at 50 Pascal. So really the bulk of the buildings being built in the Northwest, there might be some outliers that might be a little bit leakier, but the bulk of the buildings right now that are being built in the Pacific Northwest are probably tight enough that would require mechanical ventilation. So one of the big questions though is you can install your ceiling fans and your exhaust fans, for example, in bathrooms, but do you actually get the CFM out of those fans that you think you're getting after they're installed? Because the fan might be rated at a certain CFM, but once it's connected to the duct that leads to the outside, you may not actually get the CFM out of that fan that you think you're getting because of the duct run. So this would actually require you to test to make sure you're actually getting the CFM you're getting, to make sure that the building has the right amount of CFM from a ventilation system. And there would be certain ways to do it: a flow hood box, a flow grid, or other airflow measuring devices. Currently in some jurisdictions in Idaho, for example, some of the jurisdictions already require this to make sure they're getting the proper CFM. Especially as buildings are getting tighter, you need to make sure you can get moisture and that type of, indoor air quality, any poor indoor air quality, outgassing and that type of thing out of the building. And this is kind of your safeguard for doing that. So again, this particular proposal would require that all ventilation systems would be tested to make sure you're getting the right amount of CFM. If we can go to the next slide, please. One of the things that's coming down the line right now, there are several cities in the country that are really trying to heavily push efficiency in their cities to make sure they're actually going above code, not just with code. And when you start looking at the energy use for residential buildings, you realize that water heating loads are some of the larger loads right now. We've done a really good job in the building envelope. We've done a really good job on the mechanical for the most part. We can probably get a little more efficient on that, but right now from a code standpoint, mechanical is, we're kind of pushing on that, but water heating is kind of one of the untapped sources of energy efficiency that we haven't hit hard. And we are requiring piping insulation in the code right now, especially for circulation systems or for some of the distribution systems. but we haven't really had the ability to impact the actual water heater itself. So what this particular requirement would do would be essentially say that you can put in a water heater that meets the National Appliance Energy Conservation Act, certain water heaters that meet that, which is the minimum NACA requirements, federal mandated, but it will tell you that if you put in a minimum efficiency water heater in certain cases, you have to put in solar with that water heater or some way of increasing the efficiency. So for example, the storage gas water heater with a uniform energy factor, or UEF, that meets the requirements, and I'll show you the table in a second, is slightly higher than the minimum right now. Your storage electric water heater with 1 kilowatt of on-site renewable energy would be allowed. Heat pump water heaters, tankless water heaters, grid enabled. These are all still by NACA standards minimum efficiency, but they are a higher level of efficiency. So it makes sense to install these versus a standard electric storage water heater, for example, or a standard gas storage water heater. There are some exemptions on here. For example, if you actually put in water heating with renewables, that's one of the exemptions. So it's kind of pushing you to offset some of the energy use of some of the lower performing minimum efficiency water heaters with renewable energy. So this is an interesting one because when you start looking at, for both residential and multifamily, you'll realize that multifamily, especially, your water heating use can be pretty significant. Some of the studies I've seen show up to about a 40% of your energy load in multifamily is through your water heating. And so this would actually ensure that you install higher efficiency water heaters than the base case water heaters you're putting in right now. So I think this is an important one to take a look at again. It's worth it reading the reason statement on this about that the proponent submitted and the technical background on this one. So again, this is RE 126, and I think it's definitely a big energy saver for buildings. So if we can go to the next slide, please. This particular, that we mentioned the uniform energy factor on here, and here's the table for that. So you're basically, this is a new rating system for residential scale water heaters. And so the requirements we just showed up above would apply to this particular table. You'd say based on your first hour rating of either very small up to high, this is the UEF values you have to have for that. Slightly more efficient than the base case water heaters, but again, it's a it does reduce your water heating load for that building. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So we have had lighting requirements, lighting efficacy requirements in the code since I think 2009 that basically say that if you put in a connected light, it has to meet a certain lighting efficacy requirement in lumens per watt. And so it really got us away from incandescent and got us into compact fluorescent lighting. And that's right now to comply with the code. That typically the code values have gone up from, it was 50%, then to 75%, then I think the 2018 IECC is now up to 90% high efficacy lighting in buildings. So we've advanced the percent of the amount of high efficacy lighting we need, but we haven't done anything to the efficacies itself. And if we've all watched the market, and we've all seen that lighting, that LED lighting right now is really replacing compact fluorescent lighting in most markets. And the barometer for me is when I go to Home Depot and I look at the lighting display and I see mostly LEDs, and the CFLs have been pushed to one end. So what this proposal does is actually increases the efficacy requirement. And again, for those of you that aren't familiar with the term efficacy, it's just the actual efficiency of that light measured and how many lumens of light you get out of a bulb versus how many watts of light you put into that bulb. So what this does is for the actual lamp, this is a screw end lamp, it increases it to 65 lumens per watt, which really gets us into LED lighting and some of the really high performing compact fluorescents. One of the issues and complaints we've had with compact fluorescence is the light quality. That's probably been the biggest complaint, is the light quality has been poor. There are some really good ones out on the market, but typically those are not the ones that are being installed. So this gets us again into the LED lighting for the lamps itself. And then they also make a kind of an all-in-one lamp plus luminaire or lamp plus fixture, LED type of fixture. So when you install it, everything gets installed at one time, so it's all integrated. And the efficacy requirement for that would be at 45 lumens per watt, so slightly lower, primarily to make sure that that you can actually get lamps or luminaires that actually will meet this requirement. So this does represent a bit good energy savings, moves us into the LED realm of technology. Is fairly easy to comply with, because essentially you can go out on site and take a look, and as long as LEDs are installed, you're in good shape on that. So this is code change proposal number RE7, and this passed at the hearings, but again, there was a public comment submitted on this. So, but it's definitely a good one to take a look at. This one was submitted by New Buildings Institute. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Some of the states, like I know Idaho is going to be adopting this, and I'm not sure about Montana, is the Energy Rating Index, which is basically a way of complying with the energy code by using a HERS score developed by ResNet. ResNet is the HERS rating organization that actually sets the requirements for HERS ratings, and the original Energy Rating Index came out of that particular out of the methodology behind HERS ratings. It wasn't called HERS, it's called an Energy Rating Index instead. The original, when the 2015 IECC was developed, the scores were significantly lower than what is in the 2018 IECC. And so, for example, the 2015 scores for Climate Zone 4 was a 54, Climate Zone 5 was a 55, and Climate Zone 6 was a 54. These were modified in 2018 to the actually the scores that are proposed to be struck here in this in the diagram. So what this proposal does is actually return the scores back to the 2015 IECC values, which actually it's a pretty significant drop in efficiency, or it increases efficiency by quite a bit. But it is, it could be a challenge in some areas to be actually able to hit those lower scores. So, so this particular proposal, I would take a close look at, especially again in Idaho, as it's looking to bring in a new residential code, maybe for the future, and also into Montana. If we can go to the next one. So with the prescriptive requirements in the energy code, one of the big challenges is how do we increase efficiency in the code prescriptively, and not, we spend a lot of time in the code change hearing arguing over increasing R values or putting in a better U factor, and we end up with very little gain as far as efficiencies go. One of the formats that Washington State and Oregon have basically latched onto is you comply with the prescriptive requirements of the code, and then you add some additional efficiency in additional efficiency packages. So for example, in Washington State, maybe they have an envelope package that you comply with the prescriptive requirements of the code, and then you you comply with an envelope package that might be installing better windows, more insulation in the wall system, or roof ceiling assembly, however it's going to work. So there was a lot of looking at these types of systems on a national level to figure out how can we do that in the IECC to be able to increase efficiency by, for example, 5% over the base case. So the flex point option was developed by the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition, and this option essentially requires you to get 5 points, each point worth a 1% increase in efficiency. So you'd get 5 additional percent increase in efficiency in addition to the prescriptive requirements. And essentially you would find you would have envelope measures, you'd have HVAC measures, you'd have envelope tightness measures, you'd have water heating measures. based on the climate zone, each of these is worth a certain amount of points. And so you could comply that way. So for example, if I wanted to put in build a building with less than 3 air changes an hour and install a heat recovery ventilation system in climate zone 5, for example, I would get 7% increase in efficiency, or 7 points, since I would comply with the code's requirement on this one. So in some cases, you just have to select one option, and in another case, you may have to select more than one option to meet the 5 points. But the flex point options, again, would be it's consistent with how certainly Oregon and Washington has developed their codes as far as figuring out ways of increasing efficiency. So it does have a proven track record here in the Northwest. It's just trying to now figure out how to get something like this into the provisions of the residential requirements for the national code. So there are 2 proposals, RE 206 and 207. RE 206 is Energy Efficient Codes Coalition. RE 207, it was submitted by the Northwest Energy Codes Group. The difference is that the Northwest Energy Codes Group version actually has some points for renewables for either solar or wind that are installed on site, consistent with how the Washington State language is designed right now. Both require 5 points, but that's really the primary difference between the two. So 2 good options that I think could go a long way toward providing us an additional 5% bump for the residential requirements in a very flexible manner. Connie, if we can go to the next slide, please. The other option is more in a Washington State format. It's actually, instead of points, would be options, package options, and you would pick a package, for example, mechanical or envelope or duct system. So this would give you the package options. This one almost passed in Albuquerque. Actually, was a 65 vote against. So it's probably on one that has the greatest chance of getting into the IECC. But again, this is based more on the format Washington has. But it's just a different version of the flex points, but more in a package option. So, and this one is RE 209. So again, it's worth taking a look at the monogram for these 3 proposals to kind of see which ones would work best if this is something that you would want to vote on. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The other appendix that has been submitted is a zero energy appendix, and there are jurisdictions that want to go, they actually want to incent on zero energy for residential, or some jurisdictions want to flat out just go ahead and adopt a zero energy residential appendix. This is based on the energy rating index approach, and this requires you to meet a fairly low score for your energy rating index without renewables, so without photovoltaics, without wind, without basically without or what other if you look at the definition of the renewables, there's other options in there. So it's essentially, this would be the building owner, the building only, which would include envelope, mechanical, lighting system, appliances, that type of thing, to score 47. These values were evaluated by an ASHRAE 90.2 committee and found to be buildable. So you can get there with good equipment and that type of thing. And then your goal is always going to be an energy rating index of 0. So this means that the building produces as much power as it's actually using. So that's your ultimate goal, and that can be met with installing on-site renewable or solar community renewable. So we do have a couple of options on that. But again, this is an appendix that would have to be brought into the jurisdiction after the codes, it would be brought in by actually listing this appendix. But this does give the opportunity to promote zero energy residential buildings. So, and this is RE 223. If we can go to the next slide. So, Amy, I thought if we have any questions, if we can go ahead and take the questions on residential right now before we move into commercial.
Well, that is a good prompt for folks to submit questions through the chat box. If you have any particular questions, I know that there's a lot of information to cover here, and but we don't have any just yet. So I will continue to encourage folks to send them in as you think of them.
Great.
But without any, We
Why
can
don't we,
go on commercial.
we'll jump into commercial. Thanks, Amy. Okay, so Connie, if we can go on the commercial side, again, the Northwest Energy Codes Group and New Buildings Institute and others were very active on the commercial. A lot of proposals passed in the hearings. Actually, the Commercial Code Development Hearing Committee passed a significant number of proposals for envelope, for mechanical, for lighting. But these are now most of these are now being challenged through public comments. Some want some tweaks and modifications, some want them disapproved, but we'll start kind of walking down through the proposals that we see that would certainly, from an energy efficiency standpoint, be a benefit to the Northwest. So if we can go to the next slide. Some of the changes that actually made it through, for example, that we won't be hearing in Las Vegas. One is new lighting power density values. ASHRAE came up with new lighting power density for both the whole building numbers and the space by space numbers. In some cases, there is at least a 10% decrease or some increase in efficiency, which correlates to a 10% decrease in the lighting power density that's going to be allowed to be installed. So there's some pretty significant energy savings in those new tables. They passed. There were no public comments submitted, so those will go to what we call the consent agenda to be voted in with a whole number of proposals that actually that weren't challenged through public comment. Another proposal that went through was actually to increase the water heating efficiency up to 92% for high output service water heating, which will have a direct impact on occupancies like multifamily that use a lot of water heat. So that again was not challenged, and that will go into the public comment or the consent agenda and will be passed automatically. There was some clarification and restructuring of the IECC that was not challenged. This essentially got rid of the terms mandatory and prescriptive in the code that was creating quite a bit of confusion. And now if you are complying with the prescriptive requirements of the code, all of it's mandatory essentially, and a new table was developed for what they consider mandatory if you're using the performance approach, things that cannot be traded off. So prescriptive is all assumed to be mandatory, and performance approach will have mandatory features you can't trade off in that approach, but again, that will be listed in a separate table. Also, fenestration efficiency for U factors, there was significant changes made on that, so it actually will increase the efficiency for glazing. Not a huge amount, but a certain amount, but it gives us pretty good energy savings for commercial buildings. So some of these have already made it through and will be. You will not be voting on it other than voting through the consent agenda. So now let's take a look at the proposals that actually you will be able to vote on as moving forward. The first set of proposals that actually passed at the hearings that are being challenged right now actually increase the efficiency for below grade walls in our climate zones, mass floors, and raised floors where you might have a raised commercial floor with that's framed with either steel or wood framing, and then unheated slab on grade too. So in general, the slight increases in efficiency, for example, for below grade walls from an R7.5 to continuous insulation to an R10. So based on your materials, you're bumping that up. Maybe you had 1.5 inches of foam board, and now it's a 2 inches of foam board that you're using that, and that's going to be for Group R occupancies. I'm just looking at for Climate Zone 5 and Marine 4. So typically your Group R occupancies will have higher levels of efficiency, just because from a thermal standpoint, people occupy these buildings at night when the temperatures are coldest, and so it makes sense to actually have lower levels or better insulation in these than a commercial building where you operate the building during the daytime, and your temperatures aren't as severe. So in general, these particular upgrades in the code will require you to have higher levels of continuous installation. And the one thing I do want to point out, similar to what I pointed out on the residential, this is only one way of complying with the commercial provisions of the code. There are also methods like the ComCheck software that allow you to trade off these installation levels. But you're basing your trade-offs against these levels. There's also the performance approach where you can trade these levels of insulation off too. So if you choose to go prescriptive and you choose to use this particular table, these are the values you'll be installing. But again, you can trade these off using other methods to kind of optimize your building and to come in at a lowest first cost. So CE 61, 63, 64, 66, and 68 are the primary proposals that account for the changes that I'm showing in this table. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So solar heat gain coefficient was also modified in our particular climate zones. You can see that it's kind of encircled by the red box. We don't have the climate zone numbers up on top of here. But you can see that the values essentially dropped. And there's two things that happened. One is the orientation specific values went away, and now we're just at fixed at operable. The operable values are lower primarily because your solar heat gain coefficient is impacted by the amount of frame you have around the window, and operable windows have more frame per square foot of window than a fixed window does. So typically these values will be a little bit lower. So now your options are just, if you have an operable window, here's your requirement, and if you have a fixed window, then you'll have a separate requirement. Again, from a cooling load standpoint, especially as we start seeing, temperatures creep up into the low 100s during the summertime for some of the areas in the Northwest. Solar heat gain coefficient plays a bigger role in sizing your mechanical system and also reducing your heat gain into those spaces. So it's kind of an important aspect to make sure that the windows, that you have good low SHGC values for your particular building. If we can go to the next slide, please. One of the biggest, kind of a big change that's being moved into the code, and this is being submitted by the Northwest Energy Codes Group and also a representative from Steve Winter Associates on the East Coast, is to actually make air leakage testing for commercial buildings mandatory. And for most types of buildings, there are some exceptions but right now, Washington State has got mandatory testing for air leakage testing. So we've learned from them. And so there were two proposals that were submitted. One is for requiring Group R and Group I occupancies to be air leakage tested. And these will actually be tested to a 0.30 CFM per square foot of enclosure area. It's a slightly different metric. I encourage you to learn about the difference between enclosure area versus leakage to the outside, because there is some controversy on that. And then there would also be a requirement for mandatory testing for all other commercial buildings at the 0.0 CFM per square foot of envelope. There's been studies out right now that actually show that buildings that are not tested may not hit the actual 0.4 CFM per square foot of leakage, maximum leakage that is really mandated by the code. The code gives us three options. You can either test, you can either install materials that comply with the code and seal between those materials, or assemblies. The materials and the assemblies are the challenging ones, though, of actually making sure they're installed correctly. And to make sure that we're getting as close to meeting our threshold of 0.4 as we possibly can. So two requirements or two code change proposals. CE 96, CE 97 would require mandatory testing. CE 99 would require that any building that does not test go through envelope verification. So essentially, you're making sure you have a person looking at the plans to make sure that the envelope details are designed correctly to meet the air leakage requirements, and then a person doing spot review on site to make sure that the materials and the assemblies are actually being installed correctly on site to make sure that you can you're actually meeting the air barrier requirements. Now, there was some amended language that was put in here that was passed by the code development hearing that basically allowed the code official to be able to be the third party to be able to review this. So in rural jurisdictions where you may not have this expertise, the code official, which would be, whoever does your plan review and inspection, could actually do the review on this to make sure it complies with the code. But this is kind of a good proposal to get in, primarily because it will ensure that the building is being built to get as close to meeting the 0.4 CFM per square foot as possible. So I think that this is kind of a needed requirement in the code. So, and that is going to be CE 99. If we can go to the next slide, please. One proposal that this is, I think, the third time through of trying to actually get this in is to have it so that the receptacles in offices and break rooms and coffee rooms, classrooms, actually you can turn these off on a scheduled basis or through occupant intervention. They're called controlled receptacles. Right now, we're looking at, when you look at a commercial building, we have requirements for the building envelope, mechanical system, lighting system. We have a lot of controls for mechanical and lighting. And when we start looking at the energy use in a typical commercial building, all of the energy use for those features are going down, but plug loads, essentially things that we plug into outlets, that's becoming a larger and larger piece of the pie, the energy using pie. So what we're trying to do right now is figure out how can we actually reduce the energy use for things that are plugged in, like desk lamps, like computers, like copy machines, things like that, that actually are typically could be left on all night. So they drive energy use in buildings for quite a bit and a very high percentage. So this particular proposal, again, will just require that receptacles be switched automatically, so that if you're not there, then they will turn off, and it requires 50% of the receptacles installed to be switched off. The receptacles you have two options on this. One is that you can actually switch for your receptacle. The top of the receptacle can switch on a control. The bottom of the receptacle will remain hot the whole time. Or you can install a receptacle that's completely switched and another receptacle next to it within 12 inches that is not switched. So it gives you the options of which of the receptacles to use for plugging in your equipment on your desk equipment and that type of thing. This proposal did pass by committee. And again, it is being used currently right now in Washington State. I can't speak for the other states, but it's definitely a worthwhile one to take a look at. One of the issues that has come up on this is a safety issue, in that receptacles, when you look at offices, you might have one receptacle on one side of the room and the other receptacle on the other. The way these were being installed, and one example that's been brought up is one receptacle was hot, the other one was not. And so the office occupant actually had a string of daisy-chained power cables from one side of the office to the other, and it created a tripping hazard in the office. So this eliminates that potential. So again, this is CE 216. It's definitely worthwhile to take a look at. This did pass, and but there was a public comment submitted on this. If we can go to the next slide, please. So we talked briefly about the lighting efficacy upgrade on the residential side of 65 and 45 lumens per watt. The identical proposal went into the commercial at 65 and 45. This will impact dwelling units in commercial buildings, so high-rise multifamily, 4-story and above, or other occupancies where you may have actual dwelling units. So this would be for the connected loads in those spaces. So this one did pass in the commercial provisions, the commercial hearings, and it is being challenged through a public comment to actually lower the 65 lumens per watt down to 60 and increase the lumen per watt for luminaires up to 50. So again, it's worthwhile to take a look at this one in the monograph and kind of track this. But I think, again, this does definitely reflect the technology that's out on the market right now. And the 65 lumens per watt is actually a fairly conservative value based on a review of the Energy Star lamps that are currently out on the market right now. 65 is it's certainly not a high-end lamp. It's more of a low-end lamp, and there's several manufacturers that produce lamps that are significantly more efficient than the 65 lumens per watt. So this is definitely a fairly conservative value. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So we talked in the residential side about getting the flex points into the code as far as increasing efficiency for residential by 5%. We have had what we consider the package options in the commercial provisions of the IECC since 2012. Essentially, you would comply with the prescriptive requirements of the energy code, and then you would pick an option. And the options, the original 3 options were a better lighting system, a better HVAC system, or renewables. And then in 2015, that got increased and a few more options were added to that. 2018, it was up to 8 options. And during the Washington State commercial code development process a couple of years ago, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory did an analysis to look to see if the options were actually energy equivalent. When these were put into 2012, it was assumed that these were roughly 3 to 4% increases in efficiency. And so you were fine picking any one of them because you were going to get about the same amount. The bar chart we have shown on the screen right here shows actually the discrepancy in efficiency between things like reduced infiltration based on the occupancy shown below, which is less than 1% increase, versus reduced lighting power density, which in some cases is over 5% increase. So based on what you select under the 2018, for example, you may not be getting your 3 to 4, you may be getting a lot less, or you may be getting a lot more. So in the analysis that PNNL did, one of the game plan was to figure out a platform where we could equal the playing field. So make sure that instead of going with a package approach, we're actually going with a points-based option. And in this case, you're required to reach 10 points based on several different types of measures, the measures that we're currently in the code, plus a few additional measures. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So PNNL developed a series of tables that look like the one on your screen here, with the type of efficiency measure on the left-hand column, your climate zones across the top, and you go ahead and select up to 10, a minimum of 10 points. So for example, I could select a better heat or better cooling system, for example, in climate zone 5B, and my cooling system would be 5% better than base code, and I would get 5 points for that. And so I could actually kind of build up the efficiencies, my points based on selecting certain efficiency measures. So this is the new format that's being proposed right now in the IECC. Again, it does level the playing field significantly because now everything is on the same level of efficiency. As part of this process, also took a look at some of the problems and issues that we're having with the current format of the code, and there's been some issues with equipment efficiency because right now you're required to have a 10% increase in efficiency for both your heating side and your cooling side if you have for example, a gas electric system on your roof, package system on your roof. And this has been problematic for installers or for code users. So one of the modifications made to this is to say, we're going to go ahead and split the piece of equipment up. And so you can get points by just having an increase in efficiency on your cooling side, either 5 or 10%, or your heating side, either 5%, 10%. And this will provide a lot more flexibility and really make this a lot more realistic methodology, a method for doing this. There's also the addition of efficient kitchen equipment, and this was an initiative by the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance that was first put into Washington State, but it recognized the fact that commercial kitchen equipment actually uses a significant amount of energy. So now you have the option of increasing or actually installing equipment and getting credit for it from a code compliance standpoint, and you'll get a certain amount of efficiency there. Reduce lighting power density. This will be 10% reduction in LPD. So these are just some of the measures that are now part of this in the new analysis. So anyway, so instead of, again, picking a package, you'll pick up to 10 points, and the total amount of efficiency gain for this option is about 2.5% increase in efficiency across the board. So anyway, again, it's going into Washington State right now, and it makes sense from a kind of level the playing field standpoint to move in this direction. We can go to the next slide, please. This proposal did pass the hearings, and there was CE 218 plus a few that kind of nested underneath. In evaluating these proposals, once the dust settled after the hearings, PNNL and NBI realized there were some problems, a couple of problems and issues with the format, and so we submitted some public comments on this to try to fix this, to make sure that it was actually going to be usable in the state. So the analysis was redone on some of the climate zones, and heat pump water heaters, which are becoming part of the market right now. There's more points provided for heat pump water heaters right now than there was in the past, based on, so there was a public comment submitted to actually modify those points to move the points up. If we can go to the next slide, please. Public comment 2, we realized that these options also apply to low energy use buildings. The original, the current format in the 2018 also applies to low energy use buildings, but the modification of the format actually had an unintended consequence, is probably the best way to describe it, on how this would apply to these buildings. And so some of the buildings were exempted. A utility and miscellaneous group U, for example, are exempted because it doesn't make sense to add these additional efficiencies on here. Some of the number of credits were reduced to 7 credits for Group S, factory Group F, high hazard Group H, low energy use buildings as defined in C40211, and equipment buildings, because again, right now in the 2018, the packages apply. So this was reduced to 7 credits just to make it more realistic. And the other change that was made was basically high-rise multifamily. In certain climate zones, it was difficult to comply with the requirements in this new format. So that was reduced to 7 credits from 10 credits. So again, it was just a way of making sure that this was going to work for building stock that was out there, and it wasn't going to be an unrealistic, some unrealistic expectations to actually meet the 10 credits. So public comment 2 modified how the options, the credits will apply to low energy use buildings and also to multifamily. And last but not least, if we can go to public comment 3, the amount of renewables that are in the code were reduced based on the current requirements in the 18, and so the points were adjusted downward to reflect the reduction in the amount of renewables that were put into the original proposal. So that was just a reflection that you're not going to get as much credit, but then you don't have to install as many renewables. And this reflects high-rise type of construction where you may not have a lot of roof area and things like that to actually be able to meet the threshold that was currently in the current option packages right now. So this is public comment 3. So anyway, if we can go to the next slide, other public comments that are associated with this particular set of proposals, CE 226 that was approved. This actually will allow you to get credit for 10% better than lighting power densities for 15% better. Currently it's only at 10%, and if you get better than that, you don't get any credit. So this actually gave you a little bit more credit if for a better system. The enhanced lighting control requirement, CE 229, was disapproved. There was a public comments put in on that one, and then CE 240 for kitchen equipment, that was actually challenged in public comment too. So anyway, there's a public comment on that one, but again, that's brand new to this whole process, and one that makes sense because of the amount of energy use that commercial kitchen equipment uses. So if we can go to the next slide, please. There's also a set of what we're considering ready and resilient slides. So this is looking at making sure that renewables are brought into the code in a responsible manner, and you're not trading off efficiencies for renewables. One is CE 53 actually requires a bit of renewable to be installed in commercial buildings. Buildings greater than 10,000 square feet would be required to have a certain amount of renewables on that. So it just kind of integrates renewables into buildings slowly. There's also currently in the appendix, there's a solar ready appendix, so that would actually make it so your building would have to have designated areas where you can run conduit and that type of thing if you planned on putting renewables on your roof. And this change on here would be for solar and storage ready, so it actually require a certain amount of your building to be able to have storage for your solar system. So that again, this is an appendix, not part of the prescriptive requirements of the code, and this is CE 262. Next slide. The other thing is we're getting into now are electric vehicle charging stations. So this actually passed in the main body of the code, CE 217. It would require a certain amount of spaces to be both EV ready and also EV capable. EV ready is essentially requires conduit and breaker space, but you don't have to, you can just run the conduit to the parking space, whereas EV ready requires conduit breaker space, overcurrent protection wire in the outlet, but may not have, you don't actually have to install the actual charging part of this, just to make sure everything's in place. So CE 217, again, this did pass, and this is being challenged by public comment. So I think that is the last slide, and if we want to take questions, Amy, if any have come in.
So it doesn't look like we have anybody who submitted a question via the chat function, but if folks do have questions, feel free to send them along. We are available to help and answer any questions you might have about some of these proposals that Eric had talked about. I'd also, Connie, if you want to jump to the next slide. Would like to remind folks again about the, I would call it more the shallow end of codes, whereas this one was pretty technical. The November 6th will be a little bit more of an overview of the IECC process and some of these same proposals that Eric just touched upon. And I also wanted to make sure folks know that there are information about the proposals in their entirety, some of these proposals, and as well as the public comments, that you can get those from the NBI website just as they appear in the monographs. So next slide. For more information, there also IECC will have some information, and we will have some other materials available. So the slides will be, I did receive one question that the slides will be made available along with the recording of this webinar, so that if folks weren't able to attend, or you will have a link directly to the recording and a copy of the slides. So with that, we're right about at the hour. So thank you everybody for participating and for your interest, and we will look forward to talking with you next time.